As people walk in today and as we see people, what a gift your presence is. And that really is kind of the heart behind today from the very outset, is that your presence is a present. Your presence is a present. The fact that you exist matters. There's a reason, there's an intent, there's a design behind it. And as we think about this new series that we're beginning, Table Talk, as we think about John chapter 13 through John chapter 17, where Jesus spent his final hours with his closest companions discussing what we think are probably the most important things. And today, if you have your Bible, I want you to go into John chapter 13. That's where we're going to start today. That's where we're going to start not just today's sermon, but also this series, Table Talk. What would you talk about in your final hours with your closest friends? If you could just gather everybody that you care about around a table and you had a couple of hours worth of a meal together, what would be the topics of conversation? What would you talk about in your final hours with your closest friends? That's what Table Talk is really about. That's what this series from John chapter 13 to John chapter 17, where we're going to look at 4 verbs that Jesus talks about. He talks about serving, he talks about loving, he talks about abiding, and he talks about uniting in his final hours with his closest friends. What's interesting to me is that Jesus doesn't talk about theology. He doesn't give some doctrinal statements. He doesn't give some Levitical type book that people are supposed to follow. He doesn't really talk much about politics. He doesn't really talk about what's going on in the Roman Empire of the day or the religious institutions of the day. He doesn't really talk about controversial ethics, all the things you should do or should not do as a Christian. He doesn't get into the finer points of sexual orientation. He doesn't talk about the different ways in which we should or should not be behind certain educational reforms or certain things. He doesn't talk about theology. He doesn't talk about politics. He doesn't talk about controversial ethics. The things that Jesus talks about in this last night are some of the most important things in understanding who Jesus is and what the movement he started is all about. And so we're going to spend a few weeks listening in on the conversation that he had. And what's so interesting to me about John chapter 13 is that I think when we talk specifically about serving, you have to remember who's sitting at the table with Jesus. These are his closest companions, and we think of them as apostles. We think of them as his disciples. These are the people that had journeyed with him the longest, that have been around him the most. But we find some glimpses of what these guys were like in Mark chapter 10 or in Matthew chapter 20. They were a bit preoccupied with what I like to call one-upmanship. One-upmanship. They were upwardly mobile dudes. They wanted to know, Jesus, in the kingdom that you're instilling, because you are the Christ, we believe that we have sought you, we have found you, we believe that you are the Christ. Who's going to be the greatest? And if you're curious about, even if you read through John's gospel, you'll find later on, John makes a point to say that he beat Peter in a foot race to the tomb. These are competitive, upwardly mobile, kind of one-upmanship type guys sitting around the table. And as Jesus is having a conversation with this group of people, he's trying to inspire the desire and the discipline of service in them. Because I don't think it was their default setting to think, we're going to go serve the world. I think that it was their default setting to think that we are going to be served by the world. They lacked both the desire and the discipline of service. And so Jesus had to set an extreme example so that they would center this ethic of service in who they are. And that's what happens in John chapter 13. If you're there with me, verses 1 through 20, I'm going to highlight a few sections of this. John chapter 13, verse 1 says, "Before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end." This is how we know these are important topics. Jesus knew his hour had come. He knew he was in the last moments with this group of people. So, chapter 13, verse 2, during supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, Jesus rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And this was an outrageous thing. You think about it. Jesus strips down to his underwear. He takes a towel and water basin and goes to the dirtiest part of their body, their feet, and starts washing it at the dinner table. This is an extreme example. It's so extreme, you get that a bit from Peter in verse 6. When he comes to Peter, Peter says to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" And Jesus says back to Peter, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand." Peter, you might understand this in just a few minutes when I explain it to you, but you'll definitely understand it after the events of this Passover, when I yield my life in service to the world. Chapter 13, verse 12 says that when Jesus had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I've given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is the messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them." Verse 20, another truly, truly statement. "Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever receives the one that I'm sending receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me." Could we just kind of do an honest thing for the beginning today and just acknowledge that most of us don't desire to serve? Just not the default. It's not how we're trained. It's not what we grow up learning about. Maybe for some of you there's some examples of this, but I was thinking about it for me, like when we were in holidays, we just came off of Easter, and I remember growing up at Easter at brunch afterwards, you had this immaculate spread, like it was just amazing food, and you sat down and you ate it all. And I remember there was a point after all the food was eaten when our bellies were full where the men would push away from the table and maybe, wander off outside to kind of walk it off or something. And then we'd come back in a little bit later and there'd be dessert laid out. We'd sit back down and we'd max on this dessert and everything, and then we kind of push away from the table and go back. And I remember thinking, like, there was a point later in life where I caught my mom and dad talking to each other, and I realized that the table didn't just magically turn over between brunch and dessert. All the women of the household cleared the table, did the dishes, and then reset it. I want you to think about how you grew up hearing about service. It might not be natural to us. When we're at a restaurant, this bothers me so much. This is because of, so again, that's my background. Here's my present. When we're at a restaurant, we'll eat. And when we're done eating, Leslie, my beautiful bride, we'll start gathering all the plates and silverware and cups and like clearing them and stacking them and sliding them to the edge of the table. And I think, we're paying for somebody to do this. And she just doesn't, I honestly think if they let her, she would walk them into the kitchen for the staff and be like, thank you, and then leave a 20% gratuity. I don't know if most of us desire to serve. And there are cultural indicators of this as well, if you think about it. I mean, we all know how high, we just talked about restaurants, we all know how high the turnover is in the service industry. Most people don't like doing that job, even when they're compensated for it. They don't like being in a servant role, a servant position. It's why I think we have to either, in years past and decades, generations past, we've had to draft people into military service. Or now we have to incentivize it so much that people see it as a path to their own self-expression and realization of their own goals. Because serving isn't what most of us desire. In fact, you can look at it, it's well documented now. There is a massive drop happening in our culture with regards to volunteerism. People just don't want to serve. I think it fits into the Pareto principle, if you guys are aware of that. The Pareto principle says that 20% of a population are responsible for 80% of the outcomes. In most of our populations, if we break our categories in, you could go to your school's PTA, you could go to your workplace, you could go maybe even into your own family unit and the dynamics there. 20% of the population is producing 80% of the outcomes. Most of us don't want to do it. 80% of us probably don't want to serve. We're a lot like the guys sitting at the table with Jesus, wondering how great we'll be when the kingdom comes. And Jesus needs to use an extreme example to counter this, to create in them an ethic of service. Even if we desire it, does our desire to serve result in disciplined serving? You know what I'm talking about? Like, most of us have like discipline with regards to what we eat, or maybe our bedtimes, or the way we keep house, or the things that we do with our jobs. Like, we know what it is to be disciplined, but do we have a service discipline? Even when we don't desire it, do we find the will to serve? I think with regards to the church at large, if we take the Pareto principle and we apply it to churches, and we assume that probably 20% of people in the global church are servant-oriented and they produce 80% of the outcomes, I think of like a Mother Teresa. And I think most of us are banking on the Mother Teresas of the world to keep Christian reputations high. Like, we rely on the Mother Teresas of the world. We rely on the 20% of servant-oriented Christians to produce 80% of our reputation. And so that's what we're talking about today. We're not talking about today. This isn't like a guilt thing so much as it is a culture thing. Like, if Jesus spent time in his final hours with his closest companions setting an extreme example to talk about the value of serving, isn't that essential to the life of the church? We talk about it. And I want you to know, I think in some ways, even in the early stages of this church, you know that there's a higher percentage of volunteerism in this church than there is at large. Almost 40, maybe 50% of the adults that are engaged in City Coast serve in some capacity. So this isn't like a wagging of the finger thing at anybody. This is a recognition of a value. If you were watching the big game this year, Super Bowl this year, you saw some of the He Gets Us ads. They still are circulating on TV, right? This year they went big. They went into this image of somebody washing the feet of somebody else. They took that moment from John chapter 13 and they captured the essence of Christianity, and they paid millions of dollars to put it in front of millions of people around the world to say, this is what Christianity is about. It's about washing feet. It's about the towel and the basin. Not the picket sign or the doctrinal theologies of seminaries or the eloquent sermons or the massive buildings and cathedrals that are built. It is about a towel and a basin. If we just did a personal inventory this morning, do the people around you first think of the towel and basin when they think of Christians? You know, like how many people were caught off guard when they saw that ad? And they're like, oh, that's what Christians are about? I never knew. In fact, the images that they use in that ad are so poignant, they purposely counter all the other things we're known for. And they insert the towel and basin. So here's the personal inventory of that. Maybe it's because the people around me don't know I'm a Christian. That could be it. People around me don't know that I'm a Christ follower. Or maybe they don't see me serving. Maybe it takes millions of dollars in a Super Bowl ad to manage our reputation, because we don't manage it ourselves. We don't have the desire or the discipline. So my question maybe from that ad is, the He Gets Us ad, was it for the world or was it for Christians? How did God desire to use that ad? What if the world didn't need an ad to tell them that Christians were about serving? I think that there's a great cost to the world when we abdicate this responsibility of service. You hear it in John chapter 13, verse 20. There's a great cost. Jesus says that the one who receives you in service, the one who receives the one I send is receiving me, and whoever is receiving me is receiving the one who sent me. The very presence of God permeates the world through service. Through service. And when the world isn't served by the followers of God, something is lost in the flourishing of humanity. Romans chapter 10, verse 15 talks about people hearing the good news of Jesus, but they can't hear the good news of Jesus if people aren't sent to proclaim the good news of Jesus, and people can't be sent to proclaim the good news of Jesus if their feet won't move from where they are. And so the prophet Isaiah says that the feet who carry the gospel message of Jesus are beautiful feet. How beautiful are the feet of those who carry the presence of God into the world. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 15 talks about the armor of God, but in the armor, the sandals that are fit with the gospel of peace. The shoes that we wear are meant to bring the shalom of God into the world. Jesus chose to invest his presence in those people sitting around the table. And he said, when you break from this table, hands in, ready, 1, 2, 3, break. When you scatter throughout the world, you're going to take my presence, my loving service to the world. I think it's why you get this in the verses 6 through 11 when Peter's like, oh, well, if you're going to wash my feet, you should also wash my hands and wash my face. And Jesus is like, no, your feet are fine. That's what I'm sending into the world. Your feet are beautiful, Peter, and they're fit with the gospel of peace. Jesus washed the beautiful feet that would bring goodness to the world. That night, he literally undressed himself, picked up a towel and basin, and scrubbed the feet that he knew would traverse the world with his gospel. That's what it means to be an apostle. An apostle is a sent one. That's what verse 20 was about, the one I send. The one I apostle is going to bring goodness to the world. So what is the cost of us not owning the ethic of service? Less goodness in the world. But there's a cost to us as well. In John 13, verse 17, Jesus says, if you know these things, if you know that you're my follower and that a follower is not greater than the leader, if you know that I am sending you on my behalf into the world, if you know my mission, my purpose, my vision, my values, if you know me, Jesus, blessed are you, blessed are you, blessed are you, fortunate are you, happy are you, lucky are you. You are of the privileged bunch if you do them. There's a cost to the world, and there is a cost to our soul. The blessing is in the doing. The blessing is in the doing. And maybe the question for you today is just this. Am I, on a day-to-day basis, am I experiencing the blessings of God? Am I experiencing the blessing that comes with serving others, or am I experiencing the curses that come from serving self? Maybe much of the soul weariness and anger and pain and shame and grief that I'm carrying is because my whole ethic is oriented around serving myself. If I'm not experiencing the blessing of serving others, then I must be experiencing the curses of serving self. And so I just want to ask this morning, because it's, this is like the week after Easter, and Easter's like all exciting. Jesus is alive, and he empowers us to live in this amazing way. So what is he empowering us to do? What does he want for the world? What is he calling us into? And you guys you're the faithful who showed up the week after Easter. All right? I know who you are. I know who is going to be here this week. What if, I just want to ask you a church type question, like, what if a local faith community was serious about serving? Like, what would change? What would change about it? We talked last week a little bit about the good and beautiful initiative that we have going on. I just think there's 4 different organizations that we're committed to working with through this good and beautiful initiative. And with regards to the Wakeman Boys and Girls Club, I think, what if a community of faith was serious about serving, like, less privileged, marginalized, more vulnerable next generation youth would have a more equitable experience and opportunity to thrive in this world? If a faith community was serious about serving, the single moms and their kids at Ruth's house would have a safe and warm, hospitable environment for them to get their feet under them so they could step into the life that God has called them to. If a faith community was serious about serving, then the ladies that are survivors of human trafficking would find a place within Bridgeport to be restored and renewed and to enter into the fullness of life that God has designed them for. If people were serious about serving, there would not be hunger or homelessness in Fairfield County. Those that are food insecure and housing insecure would find the hope that comes from an organization like Operation Hope. Do you desire to contribute to the flourishing of cities and souls? %80 of people don't. And even those who do tend to lack discipline in the midst of it. But if you're serious about it, I think we're going to see some incredible things, not just in the coming weeks, but in the coming years. In Galatians chapter 5, verses 13 and 14, Paul talks about the freedom that comes in Easter, the freedom that comes in the resurrection of power of Jesus. He says in Galatians 5, verse 13, that you were called to freedom. You were invited to freedom, to no longer be bound and shackled by the curses of self-service, to no longer be caught in the rat race of upward mobility. You have been freed from that. And then he says, don't use your freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law, all the ethics of God are fulfilled in one. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire ethic is to love everyone always. God, what are you calling us into after Easter? What does life look like on the other side of resurrection power? It looks like loving service to the world. This week we're talking about serving because Jesus begins the meal with this extreme example. And then next week he's going to tell them, serve one another and love one another. That's how the world will know you're my disciples. That's how the world will know you belong to me, when you love everyone. Always. Just like Jesus. Around here we talk about 3 G's, being generative, generous, and generational. Maybe you caught them back at the beginning of the year when we talked vision stuff for the year, and this is a big part of this. This Good and Beautiful initiative is a big part of this. We just looked around and we thought, how are Christians going to be mobilized to make a positive impact in Fairfield County? Somebody's got to start it. Somebody's got to go first. Somebody's got to tip over that first domino. Somebody's got to say, our faith community is serious about serving. Somebody has to generate the movement. And sometimes when things have been stuck a certain way for a certain amount of time, it has to be something new that sets that spark. If only there were like a new faith community in the area, with like that apostolic energy and a desire and discipline of service. If only there was a group of people who every week talked about growing in generosity with their time and talent and treasure. If only there was like a slide that came up and literally put it in front of their eyes every single week, the resources entrusted to us, the time we're given, the talents we're blessed with, and the treasure that God entrusts to our stewardship. If only somebody was saying, let's be generous with that. Let's be generous with that. It will create something that will change generations of people in Fairfield County. Maybe you just have to think today, do I want generous grandkids? Do I want my grandkids to be generous people? I was watching the Book of Manning on the 30 for 30 thing. And Archie Manning, the father of Eli, Peyton Cooper, he said, I just always wanted my boys to be good men. And they were like, these guys won Super Bowls. Peyton Manning, arguably, not up here, but arguably the best quarterback of all time. And their dad just wanted them to be good people. What kind of legacy do you want to live? I have a couple of family members who, years ago, they lost their grandparents. So they were my cousins, and my cousins lost their grandparents, and they got this large inheritance. Like all of the cousins got these massive checks paid out. I thought, wow, that was a really generous gift. But if you were to ask them what the legacy was of their grandparents, you know what they would have said their legacy was? They were super cheap. Even though they got a big check at the end, they didn't experience them as generous people. Do you want to live a legacy of generosity or just leave one? Let's let the generations see the example that was set in Jesus, lived out through our own ethics of service. Generosity with our time, talent, and treasure. I want to live that legacy. I don't just want to leave it. Loving service is the key to the flourishing of souls and cities. I believe it. I don't know what else to tell you. It's a conviction of mine. Loving service, especially in a community or a culture oriented toward upward mobility and one-upmanship, where greed and consumption is the air we breathe, where self-service and the curses that come with it are normalized and held up as the standard. Loving service is the key to the flourishing, not just of cities, but of souls, which to me sounds a lot like Frederick Buechner. If you've ever read or come across Buechner's work, there's a really famous quote that he has. And he said it in a multitude of ways, and it's been captured in a multitude of ways. But if you're wondering, what does this look like? Where do I go? What do I do with this? He says this: the place God calls you is the place where your deep gladness meets the world's deep hunger. The thing that will enliven your soul is meeting the need of something in the world. Your vocation, another way Buechner said it, your vocation in life is where your greatest joy meets the world's greatest needs. Some of you, I know you well enough to know this, some of you love things that I hate. That's because you're uniquely suited to meet the needs that bring joy to your soul. Most of you would hate starting a church. I love it. It brings joy to my soul. Where is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet? Where is the place where your greatest joy meets the world's greatest need? Have you ever, kind of like Chevy Chase and National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, you ever stumble upon a gift you forgot to give? You bought it too early. You're like, oh, this is perfect. I was out at this festival. I saw this thing. It made me think of this person. I bought it. I stashed it away. I held on to it and stuff. And then the holiday comes, the birthday or Christmas passes. You forget to give the gift and years pass by. And finally, you find the thing that you stashed away and you're like, oh my God. It's kind of like, maybe I should give this gift now. I don't know what I should do with that. I want you to know that God has designed you as a gift to the world, and I think most of us have forgotten to give it. We're just forgetting that our presence is a present. You are an embodiment of God's grace to the world. He specifically designed and destined you for this place at this moment to do this work. You might be the greatest gift the world's not getting. And here's the thing, you don't get to decide, and this is what I think Jesus was saying in the rest of the table talk to the disciples that night. You won't get to decide if the world receives it. You won't get to decide if they want the gift you're bringing. But you have to decide whether or not you'll give it. You have to decide whether or not you are going to offer the gift of your presence to the world.